Good evening and welcome to the Talk Vermont, formerly the Racism in America Forum, sponsored by the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, Mount Mansfield Community Television, and Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Jericho, Vermont. My name is Arnold Isidore Thomas, and I am the pastor of Good Shepherd. When Black parents refer to the talk, it concerns the vital conversation they must have with their children if they're going to survive and prosper in a predominantly white, racially hostile environment. I imagine similar conversations occur among all families of color and oppressed communities. White Americans also need to have and learn how to have the talk with each other and their children as to how they will learn to live in an increasingly multiracial, multicultural nation and world where they are no longer the majority. The Talk Vermont invites you into a wide range of topics and conversations concerning systemic racism, bias, and bigotry in our state and nation, and the ways people of all races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, and gender identities may overcome them. And while our focus is on Vermont, one of the whitest states in the nation, we rely on resources within and beyond the state in addressing ways to confront and overcome these problems. We are able to enter our 5th year of conversations thanks to your moral and financial support, along with funding from the Vermont Humanities Council and the Vermont Community Foundation. Your support provides honoraria for speakers and technical assistance for program productions. We hope that you will spread the word about the talk to increase viewer participation, and that you will donate to our efforts if you are able when you register for our events. This evening, I am pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. Neil Thomas, pastor of the Cathedral of Hope in Dallas, Texas, a 4,000 plus progressive LGBTQ founded church in the heart of red state, Texas. Though it is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-age, multi-sexual orientation and gender identities congregation. We have invited him to share his experiences, hopes, and challenges of living, working, and worshiping in a state where his way of life and that of his congregation are often threatened. Dr. Thomas, a native of Great Britain, has served the Cathedral of Hope since 2015. He is widely sought after as a speaker and recognized author of books that include From Queer to Eternity, I love that title, and the Queer Bible Commentary. Dr. Thomas, it is a pleasure to have you among us this evening. And if you wish to further introduce yourself, you may do so. Just to inform the viewers, our format will be to allow Dr. Thomas the range of 30 minutes for remarks, and the remainder of the time will be devoted to conversations with you, our viewers. And Dr. Thomas, while there might be some physical intimacy in our biological ancestry, I am pleased to consider you a spiritual sibling. Welcome. And the stage is now yours.
Well, thank you, Pastor Arnold, and it's really humbling and just gratifying to be able to spend this evening with you and with others as we kind of talk about the space and the place of faith and Christianity in America today, to think specifically about our LGBTQ plus siblings and the ways in which so many of us find ourselves here in 2022 at a bit of a crossroads, I think, in the ways in which Christendom not only is represented by the church, but is also being, in some ways, rejected by America for what it has become. And I think that speaks into not only my own story, but also the story of Cathedral of Hope United Church of Christ and many other congregations who have, in some ways, been countercultural to the mainstream of what we perhaps would understand Christianity today, a nationalistic Christianity that has really, I think, separated itself out from the social justice ministry of Jesus to become a religion that is based around discrimination, judgment, and some would say hatred. Cathedral of Hope was founded in 1970, that's 52 years ago, at a time when LGBT people specifically were hearing a lot of rhetoric, specifically from the Christian right and the evangelical movement, that somehow the lifestyle, being a practicing homosexual, was contrary to God's order, and that LGBT people, specifically gay men, though, were definitely going to hell in a handbasket. I say it was a very pretty handbasket because we always decorate things fabulously, but nonetheless, a handbasket all the same. I pastored 3 congregations in my tenure as a pastor. My first congregation was in Bournemouth, England, on the south coast, which is where my accent generates from. And I pastored Metropolitan Community Church of Bournemouth for about 12 years in that congregation. I then was asked if I would consider applying for a congregation in the United States. At that point, I did not know which church it was. But I ultimately landed at Founders Metropolitan Community Church in Los Angeles, which is the actual founding church of Metropolitan Community Churches, where Reverend Dr. Troy Perry founded Metropolitan Community Churches. And I had the great honor of serving that congregation for 13 years. Reverend Perry is actually still a member of that congregation. And so I became his pastor for all of that time. And then 7 years ago, I left Founders and moved to Cathedral of Hope United Church of Christ, which at that point was looking for a new senior minister. And I had the great fortune of serving this particular congregation, where the UCC and the MCC are congregational in polity. And so unlike some other denominations, I think of specifically the Methodist, where you're placed by bishops and other like, the polity of these particular congregations is that you apply just like every other job. A pastoral search committee will then go through the process of sifting through resumes and trying to find the match for their particular congregation. And so I've always been fortunate to apply and grateful for the ministry that I've had. I went to seminary when I was 18, graduated when I was 22, and took my first congregation at 23, which was actually the congregation that I was a candidate in and did my seminary education from in Bournemouth. And it was also at around that time that the AIDS pandemic was a great hold. In the United States, much of the AIDS pandemic had already started, and it kind of landed in the UK a few years later. But by that time, we had started to hear the evangelical rhetoric of AIDS being God's wrath on the gay community, that somehow this was God's judgment, and that there was, I would say, especially in the UK, even though we're not specifically church attenders in the UK, church attendance in the UK is much, much lower than the United States, even then. But many, many people began to have this great separation between their sexual orientation and, of course, their faith, because they had somehow now begun to understand, to hear, and to believe that the Bible condemned homosexuality, and that this was God's punishment for being sexually active. In the United States, of course, we know that we lost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of folks to the AIDS pandemic, and continue to lose people to the AIDS pandemic today. But Cathedral of Hope was founded, in the 70s, and of course by the 80s had already sustained tremendous growth. And I would say that there was the perfect combination, which led to, I think, the rapid growth of Cathedral. And that, of course, was being in the Bible Belt in the South, where, if you have a conversation about what you're going to do on Sunday, the first thing you're going to be asked is, which church do you go to? And then, of course, beyond that, so most people grew up in a religious environment. And then, of course, people were desperately seeking community because of the AIDS pandemic. And churches like Cathedral were some of the very, very few places, as was, of course, my congregation in Bournemouth, England, was some of the very few clergy who would actually do funerals and memorials for specifically gay men who had passed or died of AIDS complications. So I remember back then in the 80s and early 90s, often doing 2 or 3 funerals a day. Even in my hometown, at 23, 24 and 25, which was, when I look back on it now, I kind of think I had no business doing any of this work, I'm not sure I was spiritually mature or spiritually prepared for any of that, but it's the work that we got called to do. And Cathedral, of course, was doing multiple services every day and every weekend. For gay men that were dying, and specifically people were looking for some hope. They were specifically looking for a place where they could reconcile their sexual orientation and their love of God. And I say that very specifically, their love of God, because one of the things that I know about the LGBTQ plus community is that there is a hunger for a reconciliation, a desire for to know God in a way that perhaps was not revealed in the tradition that many evangelicals and many conservative and many Pentecostals and even many Catholics grew up in. But there was a hunger, and of course, when you're facing death and you're being told that you're going to hell, and the only way to get to heaven is to confess of your sin, there is this great impetus to want to do whatever the church is telling you need to do in order to get your ticket into heaven. And so Cathedral of Hope served as not only a church, but a community center. It was one of the very few places that welcomed LGBT people. And in those early years, we would say it was the only game in town. Unlike today, where we know that there are open and affirming churches and congregations, synagogues and temples on every street corner. And I would say that the ministry of Cathedral of Hope and the metropolitan community churches really did change the landscape of Christianity in America today. That if it hadn't been for the courage and the conviction, the countercultural experience of places like Cathedral of Hope and many metropolitan community churches around the nation, around the world, I'm not sure that we would have the open and affirming spaces in the Evangelical Lutheran Church, in the Episcopal Church, to some extent the Roman Catholic Church. In mainstream Christianity, there are open and affirming churches and places where LGBT people can now freely worship beyond just what we would perhaps flippantly call gay churches. And I would say, Cathedral of Hope, whilst we claim and consider ourselves to be the largest predominantly LGBT congregation in the world, I would also advocate that we, as the landscape of Christianity is changing, that we are probably founded in and moving beyond just LGBT people. And in the congregation now that I serve, the Cathedral, beyond 1980, 1990, now in this new decade, in the 2022, even post-COVID, even though I don't actually believe that is a real term, but in a world where we're understanding COVID is here and we have to learn to navigate it in our world and in our lives, that one of the things that we are seeing is some of the dramatic growth in our congregation are straight people. I tongue-in-cheek always say that we are so radically inclusive that we'll welcome straight people into our church. And I say that really tongue-in-cheek, but the truth of the matter is, in my opinion, is that people are so tired of what Christianity represents, specifically in our country, that God is equated with hatred, discrimination, judgment, this kind of notion of an angry God that we have created, I think, through our theology of the church, and that people also have LGBT people as part of their lives. They work with LGBT people. They minister with LGBT people. There are LGBT people in their family and in their close circles. And so when they hear at church that God hates gay people, when they hear at church that God judges women's reproductive rights, when they hear at church that African Americans or people of color are not fully human and don't deserve the fullness of citizenship, when they hear this angry, judgmental rhetoric and equate it with God, it doesn't jive with their own personal experience. And so we're seeing a rapid decrease in attendance in more conservative evangelical congregations, who are in decline faster than I think we've ever experienced certainly in recent history in the United States. And there's some hope here that in this polarization that we face daily here in the States, people are starting to wake up, to become woke, and in their alertness, are not necessarily rejecting God. I would say they're reclaiming their spirituality, and that is moving beyond just the LGBT experience, even though I think LGBT people have a lot of experience and information and ability to share how we've been able to reconcile scriptures to the ways in which they have most modernly been translated. We now have this opportunity to share that gift with such a broader community who I think are in desperate need to reject a theology of a church or an institution or a preacher or those who have proclaimed themselves right and speak for God, and are actually beginning to look for an experience of the divine, the experience of God that I believe is revealed in Jesus. And I think we are on the brisk of moving people back to being Jesus followers rather than Christians. And that when you actually observe the ministry of Jesus, all that he ever did was widen the table of welcome. He stood for social justice. He stood for social change. He continued to be challenged about his own bias. I think of the Greco-Phoenician woman who said to Jesus, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs from the table, and challenged Jesus about his own perhaps theology of he didn't come for Gentiles, he came for the Jews. And this Greco-Phoenician woman challenges him and says, no, I think you've got to expand that vision. And in that expands it not just to women, but extends it, I believe, in this this understanding of the God that Jesus served, that as Jesus followers, we have an individual responsibility to keep faithful to this gospel of love and radical inclusion, and to reject this notion of a God. I've said to people before, if the God you believe in hates the people you hate, then you've created God in your image, and have failed to understand that you're actually created in the image of God. And the challenge of that, especially as followers of Jesus, is to understand what it means when we say it is the Christ in each other that we greet one another with. And as human beings, we're messy. We do things that we perhaps would rather not do. But the gospel of Jesus teases out in us the Christ within us, and encourages us to meet that Christ in others and to tease it out of each other in a growing, living, vibrant way that is beyond doctrine beyond, I would say, even the pages of the Bible, that moves us beyond to a place of a living relationship with God, that I believe Jesus had himself. And I think that is one of the things that, as I think about, I'm 56, I've probably got another 10 or 12 years in the pulpit, I hope, God willing, that I hope that in this last decade of my ministry, that I want to commit my life to reclaiming this sense of holiness for every individual. And that goes beyond LGBT. That goes to, I think, the saving Christianity, saving the church from itself. And if I can do anything to help people reconcile their understanding of God, their understanding of their divineness, their belovedness. We are the children of God. We're not stepchildren or adopted, but we are fully citizens in this new realm of God. And we're going to be different. We're going to express things differently. We're going to believe differently. We're going to live that out differently. But God never created a homogeneous person. God created us all different and all beautiful and all holy and all divine. And the challenge for us as individuals is to recognize that in each other, not to judge it, but to live more fully into it. And that's what I think Jesus did. I think that's what Jesus did with his small group, those 12 disciples that followed him around. I think that's what Jesus commissioned Peter to do when he said, "On this rock, I'll build my church." I think that's what Jesus continues to do when we follow in the way of Jesus. When Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," I believe that he's calling us to that higher self, to live by the way, but in the truth, and to bring life. And we can't do that if we're using the Bible as a weapon. We can't do that if we're judging people. We can't do that if we're pointing the finger at other people. Rather than, as the Apostle Paul would say, to work out our own salvation and to work that out for ourselves, and then let God do all the rest of it. I think if we could begin to do some of that work, if we could begin to actually believe that that's possible, the polarization that we see in our country, the pointing fingers that we see, the ways in which we make the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday the most segregated hour in the United States of America, perhaps we could begin to do some of the vital work of reconciliation and grace and love that Jesus preaches over and over and over again. So, that's a long introduction, I know, but I think that, a church that's founded in the LGBT community and moving beyond has such a gospel, such a message, that I believe the entirety of Christendom needs to hear it. And why is it important that it was founded in the LGBT community? I think it was important because many of us were faithful before we were rejected. And it was actually through the brokenness of the rejection that we began to discover who Jesus is. And I think that there are many of us in the world right now who are broken around religion, broken around their relationship with God. And there is a sacredness to the gospel that we carry forth to this new generation of people who are looking for something beyond what they have been sold, specifically by white, conservative, evangelical Christianity that I'm just going to say, from my perspective, has nothing to do with Christianity, but has everything to do with power and control. It's everything to do with white nationalism. It's everything to do with the last bastion of making America a Christian nation that is not necessarily based on the Christian value of the gospel. So I have so much more I could say, but I want to honor my 30 minutes and kind of stop for a second and kind of just allow you to respond, or allow other people to respond as well, and ask whatever it is I might be able to offer this evening in all humility and with all transparency and with all honesty.
I am so glad that you are with us. May I call you Neil?
Please do.
And please call me Arnold, Neil.
Thank you,
Um, you should know that Vermont is considered not only the whitest state in the union, but also the state where you have the least number of people associated with any form of religion, institutionalized religion. And so that may be intimidating for a lot of people, but I think it also provides an interesting ground for people to explore their questions, and also to explore whatever faith traditions they may have had trouble with, because I think many of them have felt excommunicated in some way from the church. Or not only the church, but other faith traditions as well, for the very reasons that you have mentioned. And so I'm glad you provide that option for people. You should also know that you said you started your ministry in the 80s.
Yes, sir.
That was and during and it was also the height of the AIDS epidemic. I remember my brother came out to a very conservative household about that time, and well, actually before that time, and went to live in New York City because he felt that he had a stronger sense of community there.
Mhm.
But he also contracted AIDS. He was in a very, very loving relationship with an individual who did not know he was HIV positive. But he had also become a member of and I'll name the church, the First Presbyterian Church of New York City, that had a very vibrant community that included a large number of LGBTQ members. And when doctors and nurses and health professionals refused to treat him, that church provided a round-the-clock vigil to advocate for him. Never left his bedside. There was always a person there that advocated for him and made sure that he, as well as his partner, received the right and just kind of treatment. And so he eventually died of the epidemic, and was his urn is one of the first to be situated in that church. So every time I go to New York, I make sure to stop by and I guess you can say offer my respects and love. But it was nice to know that there was a place where he and people like him could feel at home in their faith when other places were rejecting him. I have a question that I'd like to raise, and then allow for others to raise what questions they have. Yours is a diverse congregation in many ways, and I imagine that diversity includes political affiliations as well. Is that true for the Cathedral of Hope? And if so, how does that translate in what you say from the pulpit and your pastoral relationship with such members?
It's a great question. We're in the South, and obviously, we do have people across the political spectrum. When we try not to talk party politics from the pulpit. I think that that has been part of our polarization, which is not helpful. What I do talk about, though, is the politics of Jesus. And, I happen to be one of those who believe that Jesus's thesis, if he was to write his doctoral statement today, would be summed up in the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks very, very passionately about who's going to inherit the new realm of heaven. And talks about, from his Jewishness, this, the greatest, in some ways, the greatest passion and commitment to not only social justice, but to hospitality. and hospitality in a way that perhaps we don't understand that word today, but this sense of hospitality that the need of somebody else is beyond themselves, and the desire to repair the earth that comes out of Jesus's Jewishness. We can't forget Jesus was a Jew. Everything was written through a Jewish lens. We have translated that through a Christian lens, but the truth is that even the gospel writers were Jewish. And so you have to understand that social location. And so when you have that framework, and you have the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus's politics were very liberal. I mean, they were radical, to the point where, you know, he challenged those who believed that they somehow had a privilege, that wasn't part of this gospel, that the reality was that we were here for the poor, for the oppressed, for the marginalized, and that we should do everything in our power for this work of hospitality to ensure that fairness and equality and the needs of others came before our own. So, you know, when you understand that, then it's almost hypocritical to then begin to talk about those who have versus those who have not. That our job is to level the table plan. And that has nothing to do with party politics. That has to do everything with the politics of the one that we say we follow. That's why I refer to myself as a Jesus follower, and not necessarily just as a Christian. And I've said, and I will say this tonight, if the politics of Jesus doesn't jive with the politics of the voting booth, that's not my problem. That if we are truly committed to following Jesus, then I'm not concerned with who you vote for. I'm concerned with where your politics with a small p fit in with Jesus, and help me to understand how we can vote for somebody who's a liar, who's a cheat, who is everything that I see against the values of the one that we say we worship on Sunday morning. And I will challenge that. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you ultimately what you should believe, but I'm going to be faithful to the gospel of grace and love. And I'm going to be faithful to what Jesus commands us to do, and commands us to learn, and commands us to live in the gospel that we preach. And the greatest commandment is to learn to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, to learn to love yourself, and out of that, to love your neighbor. And I can't love my neighbor if I'm not giving them healthcare. I can't love my neighbor if I can't put food on their table. I'm not loving my neighbor if I believe that somehow somebody else is less than me. And that's got nothing to do with party politics. So, you know, thank God I was called to preach in a pulpit, because that gives me a place where I can echo the politics with a small p of Jesus. Mm. And anything else is the politics of humanity, which is, you know, let's be honest, when we look at the letters of the New Testament, that was what much of the letters were doing. They were confronting the ways in which human influence, false teachers had entered in, and Paul and Peter and much of the epistle writers spend their time challenging it and saying, no, you're not here to listen to false preachers. And I'm not here to cast aspersions upon other places. And we know that there are some false prophets and false teachers that have led the church into a different direction. And those of us who are the remnant, just as the remnants always existed, are called to return us to that faithful place.
Chuck, you have a question. Thank you. Thank you, Neil.
Reverend, could you talk about the young people that you encounter young people, young adults, what is their journey like, and how is that evolving, and where do you think it's headed, and what should the rest of us know?
Sure. Thanks, Chuck. That's a great question too. So we do have a youth group, and we do have kids in our church. We're very grateful and very blessed. They predominantly come from two different spaces. One space is a number of LGBT people that are now adopting or fostering children out of the foster system, or who are having children by birth through surrogacies and other methodologies that have children now in their families. I adopted an 8-year-old girl from a baby. I was present at her birth. She's the light of my life, Sophia, and I'm grateful to be her dada. And as I say, she's now 8 years old, going on 30. So anyone who's a parent knows what that's like. So we have that one demographic of population. Then we have another demographic of population of kids who are straight, and parts of families of our straight folks who come to church. And then we have another sector of kids who have chosen to come, especially as young adults, to a space where they can, use their pronouns, where they can find their gender fluidity. There was a time, Chuck, especially I think of my own childhood, my own growing up, where you had to choose a side. You were either gay or straight, and if you were bisexual, it was because you just hadn't picked a side yet. That's certainly not what we believe, or even what we understand today. We understand today there is great diversity of sexual orientation. There's great diversity of gender fluidity. My pronouns are he, him, but there are others that are he, they, or she, they, z. There are a number of different pronouns, and I think much of that is an attempt to bring about a self-identity that sits comfortably with the human spirit, with the human experience. And so I'm all for allowing people to identify wherever they find themselves on whatever spectrum they might discover. And I think, quite honestly as well, we undervalue our youth and young adults, and somehow as older folks believe that we have everything to teach them. But I actually think they have a lot to teach us about the ways in which they have discovered God, or even come to understand spirit. That somehow, sometimes we try to pour old wine into new wineskins, instead of allowing that freshness and that sweetness and that newness, because we've lived in such a binary world. Right, wrong, male, female, straight, gay. Everything has been about binary. And what we're discovering in youth and young adults is that they are teaching us something about fluidity, and that there is nothing to be afraid of. And so often we're afraid of all sorts of things. And that fear comes out in control. That fear comes out in the ways in which we treat one another. That fear comes out in ways that we want to even manipulate the situation. And I think that as I look back through religious history, I see that about every 500 years, there's kind of a come to Jesus moment, or a reckoning, a reformation, if you will. And here we are in this new 2022, and I somehow believe that we're in another reformation period. And that reformation period isn't going to come from those of us who've been around a long time. I think that reformation is continuing to evolve, but I think there really is something about our youth and young adults that are leading us into a new freedom that moves us out of the rigidity of everything, and a new freedom that if we would just allow the Spirit to blow where the Spirit's going to blow, if we were really faithful to that spirit of Pentecost, as a church, as an institution, as individuals, we would have nothing to fear but everything to gain. And I'm excited about seeing where I even hesitate to call it the church, I somehow think the church is dying, but there is something new that is evolving. And that new thing is going to be a place where folks connect, where they find some freedom to share their experience without judgment, where they're able to articulate God in a way that our rigidity has prevented us from doing so. And that perhaps there won't even be clergy like we know them today. There'll probably be gurus or something that lead us in the path, which will include Jesus as Savior, but I think it will look very differently than what we have traditionally institutionalized in our so-called Christianity. So I'm hopeful. I have to remain hopeful because I've always looked back in history and see how the Spirit does a new thing, and often does it sometimes in spite of us, and sometimes drags us along kicking and screaming. But my hope is that we will take time to listen and expose ourselves and open ourselves to the new thing that God is doing. And that's certainly been the LGBT experience. We somehow had to reject this notion that God was displeased with us, that God didn't love us, that God was judging us, to move to a different sacred place where we could reconcile our Christianity, our spirituality with our experience and with sacred text. And I think we're better for it. Is that helpful, Chuck?
Yeah, thanks.
Arnold, I think you're muted. It's the phrase of the 2020s.
I have another question to raise, and when I see another hand comes up, another question raised, I will bow to that individual. But because your church is very visibly an LGBTQ founded congregation in what I consider a rather red state, have there been threats upon your congregation or threats upon your life?
Absolutely, there have, Arnold. I receive emails and letters pretty frequently from folks who have threatening behavior towards me, and it goes with the territory. We've had pickets on in our church. We've had people who have come and held up signs as people come into church. The usual that you see at a gay pride parade, God hates fags, judgment is upon your soul, the usual stuff that we receive. A few years ago, we had a suspected bomb threat at the church, which thankfully didn't turn out to be so, but we have had to be extremely vigilant. When the cathedral was first built, it was actually kind of hidden a little bit off the main road. And it was a deliberate strategy, because we didn't want people being fearful about being seen coming to church. So there was actually no real driveway onto the property. It was almost like the church was in the closet. As the years have gone by, we've opened up the campus. It's now very visible from the street. We've put in a brand new driveway that has a big sign on the road, and we're actually on the main street that takes people to Lovefield Airport. So thousands and thousands of people drive past our property every single day, and so we're very visible. We have a bell wall that rings the bells on the clock tower. So I mean, there are lots of things that we have done to move ourselves out of that place and to be visible. But of course, with that comes some risk. So we have upped security over the last few years. We do have an armed police officer on staff every Sunday. So we have done everything we know we can do to ensure that those who choose to worship with us on Sunday feel a sense of safety. Because when you feel safe, you can relax into the experience of worship. If you don't feel safe, it's hard to be in that space where you can find your connection with God. So yeah, we do. We as you say, we're very visible. We're in a red state. Although I would say Dallas is a bubble in the midst of that. Dallas and Austin and other places, Houston, San Antonio, San Jose, are probably a little bit more purple than deep red. But we're not far from other places, a good 10 or 15 miles, but not far from places that would consider themselves deeply red. And of course, Oklahoma is not far away either. So, that's no aspersion on Oklahoma, just a reality of where we're located and what our position is. Yeah. But we're also grateful that we have so many other churches, progressive congregations in our neighborhood, in our city. I'm the current co-chair of Faith Forward Dallas. Next year, I'll be the chair. Faith Forward Dallas is the largest progressive gathering of clergy in the city, which is Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Baha'i, Muslim, I think I said Muslim already, conservative Judaism as well as Reform Judaism. And next year, I'll be the chair of that organization. I'm the co-chair right now. I serve with a good rabbi friend of mine. And so we have, we've established good relationship with many other clergy leaders and churches in our neighborhood that we tend to speak with at least a voice of progressive values and some would say progressive Christianity that speaks its way into the city, into each other's lives, and into each other's churches and synagogues and temples. So yes, there is risk, obviously. We have been had protesters. Somebody did spray paint 666 on our building once. We've had encounters with white supremacists, but that doesn't deter us. In some ways, one might say that they can be a gift because they remind us that we're actually doing the work of Jesus, who also was protested, so much so that he would ultimately go to the cross for what he believed in. And we are encouraged to take up our cross and follow. So, don't want it. I certainly don't want to be attacked physically or emotionally or spiritually, but unfortunately that goes with the territory. And as pastor, I do everything I can to protect the folks who choose to worship on Sundays to enter into safe space.
Thank you. We have a question from Joanna Cole.
Finally. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you, Pastor Neil, for elaborating on the question I was actually going to ask you about the relationship with other inclusive churches there in Dallas. I grew up in Texas from age 9 or 10 to when I went to the University of Texas and graduated. I guess I was about 20 or 22, somewhere in that vicinity. And I certainly wasn't out at the time. I grew up in a very conservative part of the state, the Texas Panhandle, which is probably, along with East Texas, the most extreme parts of the state in terms of being anti-gay. My question would be, and you've already alluded to it, there apparently is some cooperation between progressive denominations, religions, in sharing and supporting one another. Politically, do you act in support of inclusive legislation in Dallas, or is that an issue? Austin is like Dallas, I guess, in that it's kind of a liberal bastion in a sea of conservatism. So maybe it's not necessary, but it seems like to me, for the culture to change, it needs to be more than just individual churches doing their own thing. We need to be able to impact the social values of the community, at least to the extent of making people aware that there is an alternative that has integrity and is welcoming and supportive.
Thank you. It's Sarah, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Sarah says, thank you for that. Yes. So Faith Forward Dallas itself is classified as a gathering of clergy from progressive values that are doing the work of advocacy together. And so we are speaking at legislation opportunities, both in the city of Dallas, but also in Austin. And it's important that we speak that in, because there is such this dominant voice and a dominant culture that certainly is, even if this last year have witnessed the way in which the strategy of conservative Christian nationalism has used its voice to turn back the clock on civil rights in the United States.
Yes.
Roe versus Wade, the conversation about marriage equality, whether that is something the Supreme Court should take up, interracial marriage, contraception. I mean, just this whole slew of social values that, so yes, we do. And that's one of the reasons why we gathered, was because we understood that we needed to have a counter voice, that people knew that the dominant voice was only one voice. It wasn't, the full voice. Right. The other reality is, of course, the strategy of the evangelical Christianity is something that's been around for about 100 years, and they're living so fully into it right now. The appointment of a Supreme Court that holds these very, very ultra conservative values, and I think that the ultimate aim is to erode the separation of church and state.
Oh yeah,
that is their ultimate goal, and that we see people on new school boards, certainly here in Texas, and I know everywhere else. That evangelical Christians are getting themselves on and influencing book choices, book bans, bathroom bills, transgender rights. Just a slew of things that I thought we'd settled here in the United States, but obviously we haven't. So it's really important that we raise those voices, because there is no social change that has happened in the United States since its birth that people of faith have not had influence. And, I think about the ways in which the garnishing of religious experience and religious voices at a time such as this is probably now the most important time. And unfortunately, the liberal progressive movement of the church has not been as organized. In some ways, we've been very kumbaya. Your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, and we'll not talk about it.
Right.
But that's not a strategy. That's not a strategy that's going to work. It's not a strategy that's going to bring about a different America. And when I look at the pendulum swings that often happen, especially during Reformation periods, there is a huge pendulum swing that goes over here, and then it comes over here, and then eventually it kind of finds its way back in the middle. We're on the right hand swing of the swing, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't give up our voice. What that means is that we need to find a way in which we can be fully funded, fully strategized, and to speak again the values of Jesus and confront the hypocrisy of what we hear from the dominant culture. And that takes a lot of organization. It takes a lot of people coming together. It takes a lot of folks who perhaps have not necessarily talked to one another to actually come together and build relationship. But the time is now, and we can't wait. We have to do this work. I think America and the church is counting on us to do this work. And I'm grateful you're here today, because you get to be a part of this conversation, a part of the the change that needs to happen. And I sincerely hope that that is what we are committed to, in some ways saving America from itself. And I say that, I know I speak with a British accent, but I'm an American. I have an American passport. I'm a naturalized American. It's the only natural thing about me, but I'm a naturalized American. And so I have a vested interest in helping to shape an America that respects difference, that actually celebrates difference. And that has nothing to do necessarily with my faith tradition, although I do believe that I do this work because of my faith tradition. But in the separation of church and state, and the separation of church and hate, we need to hold to those values so that people, regardless of their faith or no faith, get to live in an equal space. And so if you're going to be in the public sphere and you're going to offer baking a cake for someone, you can't say, I'm not going to bake that cake based on my religious beliefs. Be a church and do that. You can't withhold reproductive rights based on religious bias. Because quite frankly, what's going to happen if we go down this slippery road, we're going to all go to the supermarket one day and we're going to be in line to pay, and we'll have to go in one line if we want to buy that pork joint because somebody's religious beliefs are being offended, and somebody else's line to buy a packet of cigarettes, and somebody else. I mean, it is just, that sounds extreme, but we're already seeing it, where people are being told, no, I hold deeply religious beliefs, and therefore I can discriminate. That is certainly not what it means to be a person of faith or faithfulness.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for asking the question. I have another question, Neil, because, and if you look at the website of Cathedral of Hope, it is a rather conspicuous facility, congregation. And that draws this question. I would imagine when you began, you mentioned that because Texas and the South in general is a place where religion is more commonly visible. One of the questions that is often asked is, what church are you affiliated with? I would imagine that anyone affiliated with Cathedral of Hope asked that question, might be somewhat self-conscious about how that person answers. So I'm going to expand upon the question that Chuck asked earlier regarding the youth. What sort of character, what sort of individual, what kinds of individuals that come to mind as members do you want to just share with us, without naming names, but share with us the kind of individual that's associated with the Cathedral of Hope?
Well, Arnold, the answer to that question is that it is pretty diverse. I'm obviously predominantly white, although of course there is a large people of color. We also have an Hispanic congregation that is a part of our overall church environment. We have people from every social economic background that I could possibly think of. We have couples and singles and men and women and siblings, gender fluid. We have young, we have old, we have people who are on the left, people on the right. But I think to kind of try to answer that question, I would say that the person who attends Cathedral of Hope is a person who is not afraid of asking questions, that is not needing necessarily a solid foundation beyond just their experience. That these are people who are hungry for spirituality and to make a difference in the world. That they are taking their faith seriously, not literally. That they want to do life together in community. That they have, for many, been through an experience of discrimination or rejection, and have found a way to reconcile that within their own lives. That they appreciate difference and respect difference and expect difference. That no one's opinion is undervalued. And that, as a United Church of Christ, we would say that wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. And we're serious about that. Wherever you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. And that we're not committed to putting a full stop where God has put a comma. That the revelation is ongoing. That the worst thing that we ever did was put a back cover on the Bible and somehow believe that that was the end. Whereas when I read the stories of individuals, there is much the gospel as the letters of Paul and Peter and John, that they will be canonized one day, because they are the living experience of Jesus. And that's the people that I get to hold sacred day in and day out. And I'm not sure that answers your question fully, but because of its diversity, it's hard for me. But I could lift up the transgender woman in our congregation whose wife has journeyed with her into her transition, who were once seen as a conventional heterosexual couple, who are now seen as wives. They haven't lost their identity or their love for one another. The experience has drawn them closer to one another. I lift up the African-American man who was in the music ministry of their church until it was found out, or he came out. And in most African-American churches, if you're in the music ministry, you're probably somewhere on that spectrum, but was kicked out and brought his gifts to the music ministry at Cathedral of Hope, and is now thriving, no longer hiding, but celebrating the giftedness of his voice and his music. I lift up the straight woman who's a pastor in our congregation, who comes from an extremely conservative background and has journeyed to a more reconciled place. She's still straight and completely understands the beauty of God's creation and God's diversity. And I could lift up so many examples of that kind of diversity that is expressed openly and lovingly. And when I'm stood on the chancel on Sunday morning, and I look out at this sea of people, and I see mum and dad with their arm around each other, getting ready for communion, and I see across the aisle a gay couple who've also got their arms around each other, or I see a transgender woman who has come into her fullness and blossom and is just tears running from her eye because she's in this space, or a transgender man who has found his masculinity in the midst of this diversity. I see heaven, and I see heaven here on earth, which is the prayer we pray. May your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And our job is to create that here on earth. It's not to wait for some future reward. Eternal life begins now. And we get to, you and I, Arnold, in our jobs, in our vocations, in our calling, get to make this real now as a foretaste to what is to come.
Thank you, Neil. I have a question from Anne Millette. Anne, would you want to raise the question, or would you want me to do it in your behalf?
You can do it in I think actually he sort of answered my question.
Yeah.
But I was just curious as to whether or not there was anything traditional, say, about Sunday morning. I mean, we like a lot of untraditional things in some ways at Good Shepherd, but I was just curious about what it was like at the Cathedral of Hope.
So, Anne, thank you for that. We have 4 services on Sunday morning. We have an 8:30 and a 10 o'clock service, which we would call our traditional services. We have a full orchestra, 30-piece orchestra and a 40-piece choir, who bring an element of music that I have not experienced in many places. It is full on. It's just amazing. I can preach a bad sermon, no one will remember it. Do bad music, everyone remembers. But they produce this incredible high quality traditional experience of worship. I wear vestments. We have lay ministers of worship that wear vestments. We have the procession of the cross, the procession of the Bible. I mean, everything that you would possibly see in a more traditional church experience, with a progressive twist. That's the 8:30 and 10 o'clock. Once those 2 services are over, my robes come off, my clerical collar comes off, and I put on a shirt and usually a suit, because I'm a suit and shirt kind of guy. And we have our 11:45 contemporary service, which is it would be more the more happy clappy service, if you will. We go from chosen frozen to happy clappy, all in a couple of hours. We have a praise band and praise singers, and the same message, just delivered differently. The 11:45 service closes, and then we go to our 1:30 service, which is our servicio celebración en español. And so we have a bit of a hybrid, very faithful to the Hispanic experience. And most of the folks from the Hispanic experience come from either a Pentecostal or a Roman Catholic background. And so it's more of a blended service that has elements of both. And so you can skip the liturgical high wire every single Sunday, and land in the place that you feel most welcome. And then beyond that, we have all of our small groups during the week where people do life together, all of our outreach ministries, all of our programming, right across the board, that keep the church vibrant and alive, and not just worshiping, but actually doing things to make a difference. And you can also tune in. We live broadcast our worship services every Sunday, directly from our website or on Facebook, or through YouTube. So you and they're 24/7, so you can go back to our website and watch any one of them and see what we do. In fact, what we've discovered, especially since COVID, is that most new people who show up in church on Sunday, if they're in the DFW area, have actually already worshipped 4 or 5 times online before they even show up in church. And what's interesting about that, Anne, is that they actually think they know you. So they say, "Oh yeah, I know who you are," and I'm like, "But I have never seen you before in my life."
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne.
Neil, you come out of a rather conservative faith tradition. Were you raised in the Church of the Latter-day Saints?
I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons.
Tell me about your transition from that upbringing.
That's a really good question, Arnold, because I get asked that a lot, and believe me, it has actually nothing to do with my sexual orientation. So So yeah, we were some of the early converts to Mormonism in my hometown in England. And my mum and dad, I've asked my mum before what made the transition. She said, well, anything was more exciting than the Church of England. So, when the Mormons came knocking on the door, we all just left and went to the Mormon tradition. My mum and dad divorced when I was 2. I'm one of 7. I'm the youngest. Technically, I'm not the youngest. I have an identical twin brother who's 10 minutes younger than I am. But now I live in the States. They're 5 hours and 50 minutes ahead, or 6 hours ahead. So I'm 5 hours and 50 minutes younger than my twin brother. And I remind him of that a lot. But of course, that left my mom with 7 of us all in school age. And the Mormon church was incredible. They took care of us. When mum had to go out to work, there was always a place for us to go after school. There was lots and lots of benefits to being part of the Mormon tradition. My mom started dating again after divorce. And by the time I was about 9, wanted to remarry. She went to the bishop of the state, and they said that they could not marry her. And they couldn't marry her because he was not a Mormon. And either he converted or there was no sealing in the temple. There was no official marriage allowed in the church. So they went ahead and had a civil marriage and civil ceremony. And we left the Mormon church at that point. As I say, I have great memories of the Mormon tradition and can tell you lots of stories about what's happened since, especially since Prop 8 in California, when I was meeting with Mormons pretty consistently. But what that experience taught me was that there was a big difference between churchianity and Christianity. That there was absolutely no reason why the church should deny my mother a wedding in the place that she called home, that she called her spiritual space. And realistically, it was that experience that when I started to hear, started to hear more vocally, God hates gays or God hates fags, that I was very easy to draw back on that experience and to understand there are doctrinal differences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are true. And that churches have split over the most silly of things, sometimes over the color of the carpet. And is that really building up the kingdom of God? Or is that using our bias, interpretation, lack of understanding, ignorance, whatever it is, to bring about control? And we've seen that, let's be honest, we've seen that around women preaching in churches. We've seen that about whether your hair's cut too short or too long. We've seen that about whether you wear makeup or not. We've seen all of these things that have no basis in our Christian gospel. They have everything to do with churchianity, the institution. And I'm not prepared to allow the institution to determine who's in and who's out. And so that's why we left the Mormon tradition. And it was a great thing to look back on for myself. And then, of course, to do the heavy work of, let me examine these 6 clobber passages that they keep lifting up as somehow God's judgment on LGBT people, and forget the 636 verses in the scriptures that actually talk about heterosexual behavior. But we don't want to talk about those. We'll just talk about the 6 that condemn, or they say condemn, LGBT people.
Another question. A lot of conservative churches, and I don't want to cast an umbrella that includes all conservative churches, but there are outspoken conservative churches that openly support the previous presidential administration. Some of them will say, as they cast their ballot, they held their nose because they weren't quite in favor of the person they chose, but chose anyway. And when I asked the question, why would they choose an individual whose lifestyle seems so contrary to what they believe? Some of them who are knowledgeable of scripture will say, well, he's like Emperor Cyrus. He didn't believe in God, but he provided the means by which Israel could return to their home and worship their God. So they will compare that president. We'll name names. They'll compare Trump to Cyrus, who doesn't adhere to everything they believe, but provides the means by which they can be stronger in their control and influence of the sort of lifestyle and nation that they want to create in their image. How do you respond to such individuals?
Well, as Christians, as people of the way, as people of Jesus, we're not called to follow Cyrus or even the Old Testament prophets. They're great story. They're also great allegory. They are great history. In fact, if you speak to rabbis about the ways in which Christianity has perverted the Old Testament, you will hear them say how in some ways the Christian church has stolen their Bible and made it fact rather than story or midrash or allegory or parable. In fact, some would say that the parables of Jesus come out of the midrash and rabbi experience of creating story to bring about spiritual truth. So that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, what does Jesus say? Now, I remember that the evangelical church used to give us these little bracelets that had WWJD on them. And you know, you look down every now and again and ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do in this situation? And I think that's the better question. What would Jesus do? Well, I think we have enough evidence Jesus would turn the tables over in the temple. Jesus would call out blasphemy. Jesus would decry the religious right of his day and remind them that they think they've got the highest place, but actually they've got the lowest place. So I understand people want to point back when it's convenient, but you can't do that and then say, what would Jesus do? Jesus would decry it. He would lovingly remind us today that whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done unto me. And if we have put somebody in a position of power just for our convenience, then I'm not sure that is very Christ-like.
Thank you. I'm going to continue to raise questions and not until I see a hand raised among our viewers. And that question is somewhat political. As you are very much aware, Texas has passed laws that restrict voter rights, that restrict reproductive rights, that in many ways makes it difficult for LGBTQ folk to live within that state. Does that in any way hamper the work and ministry and life of your congregation, or do they feel emboldened in some way?
Arnold, I think there are both ends on that. We have a number of people who have already started looking at moving out of the state. We have a mother of a transgender kid who actually put up a GoFundMe to find enough money to leave Texas and move to California, where her transgender kid is going to get the care that they deserve. We have other people who are like, this is my home, you're not going to take it from me, and I'm going to be emboldened to live more fully. And then we have other people who have gone back into the closet in some ways. I've just hunkered down and just like, I just need to get through it. I can't face all of this reality. So we have a huge spectrum of different peoples who are responding differently to the situation that they find themselves in. We have an opportunity in November to make some shifts and changes around the country. We certainly have an opportunity to challenge some of the voter suppression laws that continue to segregate people and to steal their vote and to make their vote less than a vote of somebody else. And I think that we have some opportunity to think about the ways in which people's rights are being taken away. Look, this is the first time in a Supreme Court action where the Supreme Court has voted to take rights away rather than extend rights. And I'm fearful that we're going to see a trend of that in the coming season. But I don't think that they should. I don't think that the fear of that should drive us underground. I think that the opportunity for us is to garnish our voices together and to say what kind of America we really want to live in. But I also want to respect the folks who need to run, the folks who need to hide, the folks who are scared. And we certainly have all of that in our congregation as well as in the state that we live in. And let's also remind ourselves that these are boilerplate legislation models that are being handed off to every other state in the union. So what they used to say, what happens in Texas ends up into everywhere else. We've already seen it: Florida, Texas, Oklahoma. We're going to see other states trying to restrict women's reproductive rights. We're going to see LGBT rights being eroded. Certainly transgender rights are already under the scrutiny with bathroom bills and youth wanting to play sports. We know that in Texas, there is this possibility that after November, there may be some move to prevent clerks issuing marriage licenses to same-gender couples based on religious conviction, to force it to go to the Supreme Court one more time. It's a strategy. And I think what this really reminds us is that actually these need to be codified into law and shouldn't be at the whim of a political justice department that can be so swayed by the appointment of a Supreme Court judge by any particular president, whether that be Democrat or Republican. That these are things that need to be codified into law so that it becomes much, much more difficult to change it just on the whim of a vote of a Supreme Court. And perhaps we thought they were settled, but obviously we now understand they're not settled. And we know that in Florida as well as in Texas, there are a group of progressive Jewish rabbis who are also challenging this new law because in Jewish tradition, it infringes their religious liberties. That in Jewish tradition, the care of the woman is above the child. And so we know this is really not about religion. This is about Christian white nationalism. Because you know as well as I do, if the person who wanted to kneel on the football field before a soccer game at a high school was praying to Allah, there would have been a very different outcome at the Supreme Court. So let's not fool ourselves that this is about religion at all. Let's not fool ourselves that this is about anything but male white Christian nationalism and the last bastion of control over people.
Some people say that we are in the midst of an ideological civil war. And from what you tell me and from what I also sense, things will get worse before they get better. Will they get better as far as you're concerned?
It always gets better. It always gets better. For the gay community, we had the phrase, it gets better. And it does, and it will. It's a civil war, you're right, it's not like the first one, thankfully, although there are elements of it. Gun control in our country needs to be addressed. So we do have some of those elements, but the civil war is about the polarization of people. And the inability to live with one another. But it is going to get better. It will get better. I would not be at Cathedral of Hope if I didn't believe in hope. I witness people who are starting to question what's going on. We're not at critical mass yet, but it does get better, and it will get better. And I hope that's what I get to leave this call with for everybody who's on it. It will, and it must get better for us all.
Yes. We are speaking to the Reverend Dr. Neil Thomas, Senior Pastor of Cathedral of Hope Church in Texas, in Dallas, Texas. I'm going to see if there are a few more questions before I offer my closing remarks. And seeing none, I want to thank you again, Neil, for gracing us with your presence. I wish to let everyone here know that this session will be recorded for those who could not attend. And I hope that we will all gain from the insights, perspectives that have been shared here. This was the second in a series of pre-midterm conversations with individuals who will be and are deeply affected by the political situation of our nation and how they respond to it in different ways. Our third session will take place on Wednesday, November 2nd, and it will include a panel of Black Democrats who will share their hopes, objectives, challenges as members of the Democratic Party. And I hope you will be able to attend that session as well. Once again, Pastor Thomas, it is great to have you here. And I'm sure there'll be other opportunities for us to talk, and I look forward to them. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and take care. Be well, be blessed, and be safe. Bye-bye.